The Old Testament reading is from the book of Genesis, chapter 6, verses 5 to 8. The Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil at the time. The Lord was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. So the Lord said, I will wipe mankind, who I have created, from the face of the earth, men and animals, and creatures that move along the ground, and birds of the air, for I am grieved that I have made them. But Noah found favour in the eyes of the Lord. And our gospel reading is from Matthew chapter 24 and verses 36 to 44. No one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in the field. One will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a hand mill. One will be taken and the other left. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. This is the word of the Lord.
So shortly before, you might have noticed Carolyn came up and tapped me on the shoulder, and she wanted to make sure the Bible readings were the right ones, which is fair enough. Being Advent, we tend to think of Advent in terms of mangers and angels and all that sort of thing, but in fact today's reading is from the lectionary reading, Matthew 24, 36 to 44, because Advent isn't just the coming of Jesus in the first Advent, but it's also the coming in the second Advent. And so it's about the appearance of our Lord. It's the appearance of Jesus who is King. And we've already had one Advent, and there's going to be another, which is going to have a lot of similarity to it. In fact, Mark Twain once famously said that history never repeats itself, but it sure does rhyme. You've probably heard that before. And it's almost as if the whole world is on some kind of elliptical orbit that repeats itself around about every 100 years. The ancient Greeks thought this, by the way. This isn't a new idea. This is an idea that's been around for time immemorial, that we're on this elliptic orbit and that we keep on repeating history over and over again. Not exactly, but it rhymes every time we come around and do the circuit again. And I've heard one theory that explained that it takes about 90 years for the lessons learned by the people who lived through the previous self-induced disaster to all die, and for those lessons to be forgotten, and then we're doomed to repeat them again. So it would seem. And then it's set and repeat endlessly through history. Again, not precisely the same as before, maybe not, but it certainly does rhyme. And if we take what's going on in the earth right now, you know, the pandemic in the 2020s, an impending financial meltdown, and the rise of populism, and the world on the knife edge of war, well, we've all done that before. About 100 years ago, we did the same thing. And now we're just set and repeat, here we go again. You know, back in the 1920s, we had the Spanish flu, the Great Depression, populist governments and world wars. Sure, we might not repeat that history exactly, but it looks like we're going to have something that rhymes a lot with it. And, I keep on hearing that the events in the 2020s, for instance, are unprecedented. I'll tell you, the only thing that's really unprecedented is the use of the word unprecedented, which has been used way too much, because it's not unprecedented. Everything that's happening now has happened before and will happen again and has happened ages ago, and it's just the same as ever it was. If you read ancient history, which I enjoy doing, by the way, the more you read ancient history, the more you realise nothing has changed. I mean, sure, we got digital cameras now, but that's about the only difference. Nothing really has changed all that much. We're set and repeat, that's what's going on. Now, Matthew 24, Jesus is actually telling a story just like what I've just told you now. He's basically saying, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be at the coming of the Son of Man. So he's saying, as history was back then, it's going to repeat itself right now. And this is what the whole of Matthew 24 is about. So let's look at as it was in the days of Noah. Well, how was it in the days of Noah? Well, according to verses 38 and 39 of Matthew 24, Jesus said, as it was in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and being given in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. And he says, in exactly the same way it was then, so will it be at the coming of the Son of Man. So what is Jesus actually saying here? Jesus is saying that the things that are about to take place in this generation, the generation in which he lived, his contemporaries living in Jerusalem, he wasn't actually talking about the whole world, he was talking about Jerusalem in particular. He's saying the things that will happen in this generation will rhyme with what happened in the generation of Noah. It won't be exactly the same, but it will rhyme. So the point he was making is that almost no one in Noah's day had the first clue about what was about to happen. And then he says, and similarly, the people of Jesus' generation will have no clue about what's about to happen either. So in Noah's day, a flood was coming, but no one knew that. No one cared. Everyone was just going about their everyday business, blithely going about their business without a care in the world. And then suddenly, out of the blue, the flood hit. But in this case, the flood won't be a literal 40 days of rain. Instead, it's going to be the invasion of the Roman army who are going to lay siege to the city of Jerusalem and utterly destroy both the temple and the citadel of Jerusalem. And that's ancient history. It's well documented too, by the way. It's one of the most well documented pieces of ancient history. Josephus wrote about it in his well-known writings, and it's detailed history if you want to read about it. Go on YouTube, watch YouTube. It's about the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, everything that happened in Jerusalem, Jesus predicted was going to happen. That's the warning he's given. So again, not exactly a duplicate of what went on in the days of Noah, but it certainly rhymes with what happened in Noah. Not a flood, but an invasion, but the outcome is pretty much the same. All right, so in a sense you can say same, only more so. Now, many contemporary Christians believe that Jesus was talking about the end of days, as if Jesus was looking forward to the actual end of the creation as we now know it. But if we read the words in context, and certainly most useful scholars will also agree with this, that Jesus was not talking about the end of days in his warning here. His warning was to Jews, it wasn't to Gentiles, it was to the Jews. You've got to keep in mind that the ministry of Jesus was not to the Gentiles. He came for the lost children of Israel. He came to turn the hearts of Israel back to the Lord. He came to gather them and to be their king. Jesus came to be king of the Jews. And then, from that beachhead, he was going to launch to become king of the world, because it was always going to be through the family of Abraham that the will of God was going to be done ultimately for the whole world. But it had to start with Israel, with the people of God. And so Jesus came to do something with them, and his entire ministry up until the resurrection was about the Jews. After resurrection, it was for the world. But up until that point, he was not looking down the road to the end of time. He was looking just down the road to the end of Jerusalem. And the big giveaway is when we look at the very first two verses of Matthew 24, to put it in context. What had happened was that Jesus had just left the temple and he was walking away with his disciples, and when one of them came to him and drew attention to the buildings, most likely one of the disciples would have said is, "Man, these are amazing, these buildings." And they were truly amazing. The temple, Solomon's temple, was one of the most amazing buildings of the ancient world. It took 40 years to build, or 46 years to be precise. It was a major thing. And you can imagine one of the disciples saying, "Isn't this incredible, this temple here?" And then Jesus says, "Do you see all these things?" You can imagine him looking around, pointing to the temple and pointing to the other public monuments. One of the reasons why Herod the Great was called Herod the Great was because he was really great at building public works. And he was the man behind the building of the temple and many of the other great buildings of Israel at the time. So you can imagine Jesus looking around, pointing at the same buildings that had just been pointed out to him and saying, "See these? See these things? Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another, for every one of them will be thrown down." That's just a poetic way of saying a serious and utter destruction is going to come to these buildings. They will not be here anymore. And then to this, the disciples say, "Really?" Almost incredulously, "You've got to be joking, surely. Who would knock these buildings down?" And then they say, "Well, what are going to be the signs that these things are going to come?" Now, we don't have time to go through all the signs that Jesus then laid out, but it is clear that he laid out a whole bunch of things that were going to take place coming up to the time when the temple was going to be destroyed. And he's saying, so keep watch. Make sure you don't get tricked by false messiahs or by rumours of wars and other things that are going on, and get caught up in all this other stuff, because the day is going to soon come. And he said within a generation, and interestingly, the temple was torn down and destroyed 40 years after Jesus said these words. And in Jewish speak, 40 years is a generation. He said within a generation, many of you who are alive today will see these things. Obviously, he's not talking about the end of days. He's talking about the end of Jerusalem. That is the context in which he's speaking. In fact, in Luke 19, we see Luke depicting Jesus as approaching Jerusalem out of the hills. And then it's almost as if Jesus, you can imagine, on the equivalent of Mount Lofty, looking down over Adelaide, but instead he's on the Mount of Olives maybe, looking down over Jerusalem, and he says these words. He said, and he was weeping when he said it. He said, when Jesus saw Jerusalem, he wept over it, and he said, if you, even you, had only known that on this day what would bring peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you, encircle you, hem you in from every side, and they will dash you to the ground. You and the children within the walls, they will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. They're pretty stern words. You know, people don't like attaching a speech balloon to an image of Jesus that had words like that. I've even heard, professors of theology say, I don't think Jesus would have ever said something like that. Really what they're saying is, I wouldn't say that, so Jesus wouldn't say it. But that's not true. Jesus said these words. Jesus said that, Jerusalem, I would have given you peace. If you just recognise your own king coming to you in this day, then Jerusalem, you would have been saved, you would have had peace. But instead you've rejected your king. In fact, obviously crucified your king. So what do you think's going to happen? You don't cross kings in ancient world. You don't vote kings in. You don't vote them out. Kings are kings. They rule. Jesus is the king, and they have rejected their king. And so he's saying that every stone is going to be thrown down. It's obviously, all part of the same story that Jesus was telling his disciples. See these stones? Every one of them is going to be thrown down, and judgment is going to come. And so that's when Jesus says, so I warn you that just as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be at the coming of the Son of Man. Now, the coming of the Son of Man that he's talking about there is he himself, the visitation of God to Israel. And this word visitation doesn't just mean that God did a sort of a drop-in kind of unannounced kind of biscuits and tea kind of thing. Rather, it's to do with an inspection. A general would visit their troops on the front line of battle and see whether they were battle ready or not. And he would inspect them to see whether they're up to grade. And so all the troops knew this in the ancient world, and they knew that if you got caught with your pants down, that it could result in you being court-martialed and executed. So, and the general would never announce when they're going to come. That's the kind of language that's being used here in the original Greek. And so Jesus is saying that God visited you to see whether you were, with the program, and it turns out you weren't. You missed the boat. And so Israel was going to be destroyed, the temple itself will be destroyed, and everyone who's still in the city when the Romans surround it will be caught up in that destruction. In other parts, we're not going to go into all the detail, but Jesus said, the last sign is when Israel is surrounded by the Romans. He said, get out of Dodge. Don't go back and get a jumper if you left it on the seat or your mobile phone back in the kitchen. Don't just leave town. If you're up on the roof, don't go back into the house, then go out. Just get down and run out of the city. And interestingly, many tens of thousands of Christians believed those words and did exactly that, and they escaped the judgment. When siege was laid to the city, it happened in one day. The siege was put onto the Jerusalem, just as Jesus said it would, and everyone who was trapped inside died mainly of starvation or by the sword, one or the other. It was one of the most horrific sieges in the history of the world. And so when we know that history and we read the words in context, it's clear that Jesus was not speaking about the end of days. He was speaking about the end of Jerusalem. So in Matthew 24:39, he says that when the flood came, they were swept away, the people who hadn't taken notice of the warning. And so will it be at the coming of the Son of Man. There will be 2 men in the field, one will be taken, the other left, 2 women at the grinding of the mill, one will be taken, the other left. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day the Lord is coming, to inspect, that is. This, I have to just say, interestingly, that passage is one of the most misquoted and misunderstood passages in the entire Bible. For some reason, about 200 years ago, some people thought that, and it's just completely made up out of nothing and nowhere, that God was going to somehow turn up and that people would be raptured off the face of the planet and go up and meet Jesus in the sky, and that those who are left were going to be destroyed, while the others would be somehow favoured and come back to the earth and inherit the earth. I honestly don't understand how that works. No one ever taught that for 1,800 years of church history. No one. 200 years ago, one person taught that, and then it took on in the United States in particular and spread to the rest of the world. It's a popular theory. It's dead wrong. Absolutely dead wrong. I don't know why people are into it, but anyway, it's a thing. Because that's not what he was talking about. And you'll notice here, he says, as it was in the days of Noah, who are the ones who are taken? The ones who are taken are actually the ones who are taken by the flood. The ones who are left are the ones who are in Noah's ark. And he said, it'll be exactly the same. The ones who are taken in the day of the first advent will be those who are in Jerusalem and didn't make good their escape. The ones who are left are the ones who made good their escape. So it makes no sense to understand it out of that context. But then Jesus went on to say, learn from the fig tree, learn from its lessons. As soon as the branch becomes tender and puts forward its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see these things, that are all the signs, he said, including the sacrifice, the Roman standards in the temple and the Romans coming and putting a ring around the city, then you'll know that these things are very, very near. Now, yesterday I had a brilliant sermon illustration just handed to me on this exact subject. I went to my nephew's engagement party, and just to give a bit of context, my nephew and his soon-to-be and his fiancée had been living together for 4 years. They have 2 children, and so they thought, we should really put a ring on this and get engaged. So they had an engagement party. So we turned up at the engagement party. Well, guess what? Turned out it was a wedding. They dropped a wedding on us, and it was shocking. But I should have recognised the signs. First of all, they said things like they wanted to know who was actually coming and wanted to get absolute numbers, get the numbers in detail. So who's coming from your family, David? And I said, well, no, I'm coming, and I think two of the kids are coming, and so on. And then when we got there, the fiancée was dressed all in white with flowers in her hair. You'd think I would have twigged on. And then there was this highly paid photographer who looked pretty on the job for an engagement party. I thought, that's a bit of overkill, isn't it? And then, of course, the Romans laid siege to the... No. But then the celebrant stepped up and said, guess what, everyone? I'm here to perform a marriage ceremony. And that's when that was only then that it suddenly hit me. Well, that's exactly what Jesus is saying was happening. He says, and he even uses that illustration about, the wise and the foolish virgins waiting for the bridegroom to come. You don't know when he's going to come. Keep your oil in your lamp and keep it trimmed all the time. Be ready. And he's saying to Israel, your king has come, you haven't recognised him, you missed out on the wedding, you missed out on salvation. And, there were many people in my family, including my wife, who missed the wedding. I could work with that. And Jesus is saying something similar to us. He says, don't miss the wedding. Don't miss the salvation that comes through the coming of the King. Make sure your allegiance is with the true King, and that you give your attention and time to serving that King, even when it seems like it's a million miles away. Now, he was talking about his day, and he used the days of Noah to illustrate the point. Well, we can do exactly the same now. Just as Jesus took the days of Noah to illustrate his point, we can take the days of the first Advent to illustrate the second Advent. It became clear in the writings of the Scriptures that just as Jesus appeared and visited Israel, he's going to visit the earth again. And we don't know when that's going to happen. It could happen at 2 o'clock this afternoon. And it might happen 500 years from now or 5,000 years from now. It really doesn't make any difference, because I don't plan to be here in 500 years. I'm only a few short years away from my own imminent demise. And some of you are in front of me, I reckon, I'm just going to say. And even if you're a child here, it's only about 50 more years and it'll be your turn. It's not long, that's the point. So be ready. You don't know when it's personally going to be your turn. And the King has come in Jesus, and he is the true King. And since the resurrection until now, there have been generations of Gentiles who are being added to the family of God. And God in his grace has given us not just 40 years, he's given us 2,000 years so far, in which to gather in millions of people. And the message is just as true then. We can take the warnings contained in this passage and recycle them and reapply them right now. Therefore, will you be ready ahead of time and set your allegiance with him? Recognise and obey and follow Jesus now, so that when he appears you don't have to be ashamed. That's the message that Jesus gave to them then, and as it was in the days of the first Advent, so shall it be in the days of the second Advent. How do you make yourself ready then? Elsewhere in the scriptures it says, make sure that you're not just doing your own thing, but be serving the kingdom of God and Jesus as its king, even when it looks like it's a million miles away, because you don't know. It could be just like that, at any time, without warning. While you're going about your normal everyday thing, you won't have time to change your mind then when he suddenly appears. So the best time to act is right now. Amen.